Hello, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and congratulations to all partners, project partners. I believe this is very relevant and important project, and very glad to be here. Let me just share my slides. Can you hear and see me well? Just to check. And the question also whether you can see my slide.
We can, but still the technical view where we can see the next slides to the left.
Okay.
Now it's
Is
okay.
it
Now
good?
it's okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So thank you very much. And as Csaba mentioned, it's my pleasure to present key findings from our recent report, which we published last month on fundamental rights and housing in the EU's climate and energy transition. So first, why this focus? So of course, adequate housing is a right in itself. Access to energy is an element of it, but these are also very important prerequisites for the enjoyment of other fundamental rights. And these are very important in the context of, let's say, three crises that we are facing currently in the EU. And of course, first of those is climate crisis. So buildings are responsible for emissions, for energy consumptions of buildings in the EU. Most, I think, at 3/4 of EU buildings are energy inefficient. But we are, of course, also facing cost of living and energy poverty crisis, where for recent years it's like 9-10% of EU population is unable to keep home adequately warm or cold in the summer. And we are also facing housing crisis. So this is like a hotspot in the context of EU energy and climate transition. And of course, all these crises, they have disproportionate impacts on older people, women, persons with disabilities, persons on lower incomes, and other groups in vulnerable situations. So this is why we are focusing on that. We are focusing on energy renovations and clean energy transition measures because they are central to climate neutrality and resilience. But they are also an opportunity, let's say, to strengthen rights protection, to guarantee rights to adequate housing for those most in need. At the same time, if there are no sufficient right safeguards in these measures, there are risks that they will leave people behind. So this is why we are using human rights-based approach to look at these policies and analyze and see fundamental rights impacts and risks of those policies. So of course, our starting point and foundation is human rights law. So I know that I'm speaking mostly to lawyers here, so I will just drop a few references, of course, with the caveat that these are not exhaustive. So first of all, we have, of course, the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, which, as you all know very well, probably binds EU institutions, but also member states when they implement the EU law. And there are relevant rights, including but not limited to non-discrimination, housing and social assistance, health, access to services of general economic interest, environmental protection. Of course, a right to adequate housing is also protected under international human rights law, including the International Covenant of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the Convention of Rights of Persons with Disabilities, to which the EU is itself a party, European Social Charter, to which EU member states are parties, and they ratify different articles of this charter. And last but not least, of course, we have Aarhus Convention, which guarantees rights to access to information, participation, and justice in environmental matters. So this is, of course, this important starting point and lens, but we also apply this operational human rights-based approach principles. So we look through the lens of non-discrimination, attention to vulnerability, participation, transparency, and accountability. And we conducted research and data collection and analysis, focusing on selected climate and energy policy and legislation, both at the EU level and at the national level, including national energy and climate plans, to see to what extent they account for fundamental rights aspects, to what extent they account for the impact, include safeguards. And then we also conducted a fieldwork research with support of our partners of our research network, Franet, who collected data, including through expert interviews in 10 member states. You have the 10 programs we looked into on the right-hand side. And we focused on programs supporting housing renovation, clean energy installations, and addressing energy poverty. And we looked at these human rights-based approach elements in these programs too. So we analyzed target groups and eligibility criteria, how accessible are these programs, non-discrimination and safeguards, information and participation, accountability, monitoring, and data. And we also looked at general outcomes and identified some promising practices. So I will try to give you a brief snapshot with a caveat that this is, of course, not comprehensive, but I selected several key findings that I would like to highlight here. So our first finding here is that fundamental rights are not systematically integrated in these policies. So of course, there are many references to just transition, to leave no one behind principles, but actually specific rights language or safeguards are very fragmented. And these principles are also not very concretely translated into specific measures that protect rights. And just to highlight here that, of course, in the EU legislation, in different pieces of legislation, there are some safeguards and some starting points. So we have the definition of energy poverty. The different pieces of legislation prioritize vulnerable groups or households. So we see that in Energy Efficiency Directive or in Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. In terms of access to energy, for example, Electricity Market Directive included the right, so-called right to universal service, and also safeguards against disconnection. Renewable Energy Directive highlights the need to ensure access to self-consumptions and equal participation in energy communities, also to vulnerable households. And of course, we have Social Climate Fund regulation that is specifically aimed to address the impact of an emission trading system for buildings and transport, including through renovation support. So this is, of course, just a snapshot, but and not all of these have been yet transposed or implemented at the national level. And of course, member states have also wide margin into how they translate it into their national legislation in terms of directives. And this is very maybe important aspect to highlight, that this national implementation is really key to ensure these safeguards in practice. And now I will move to the findings concerning programs specifically, so the funding for energy renovation, clean energy installations, and related programs in a very general terms. So what we see, first of all, is the targeting of these programs, especially for persons on lower incomes or in vulnerable situations, is really limited. And of course, they are on paper, they are open to all, and often they include also some specific income-related thresholds, a higher level of support. But often they fail to reach those most vulnerable, also because of different features of the design of the programs. And one of those is application processes that tend to be complex, inaccessible, often digital only. Often the funds are provided on the first come, first served basis. So the people who are able to submit their application earlier are able to benefit. and those who maybe face time or other barriers then are left without support. And another big point I would like to highlight here is the financing rules, which really may exclude. And sometimes it's not a matter of the level of support, because there are programs where we see very generous support, even all costs covered, but the whole architecture is still not supportive because, for example, it requires co-funding or upfront financing, and for persons on lower incomes or in different vulnerable situations, it's sometimes simply not possible. So just to give also voice to some of our interviewees, for example, expert from Greece said that vulnerable households are always vulnerable. I do not know how someone would suddenly generate money to invest in frame windows or anything else. It's very, very difficult, especially when someone is facing an objective survival issue like making a living. In an expert in Romania, in the context of support in the application processes, mentioned that you cannot compare someone from a vulnerable illiterate community with someone in central Bucharest who owns a villa, has a higher education and a monthly income of 5,000 euros. But not to be on a excessively negative side, I also want to highlight that there are promising practices that we identified in these programs. One of the important ones are so-called one-stop shops or consultants. So these are dedicated services often at local level that guide and support applicants in entire process, so technical criteria, financial application, and so on. Another solution, for example, in Estonia, we've seen that there was a public loan and guarantees for apartment associations from rural and poorer regions who maybe would not be able to get a commercial credit for renovations. So they were able to obtain either loan or guarantee to implement renovations from the state agency. Another finding I would like to highlight here is that tenants are often excluded or at risk. And this is a pretty systemic issue, and why it is important. I mean, of course, rental housing, large share of lower income households live in rental housing. So for the EU population, I think it's around a third of EU population lives in rental housing. For people on lower incomes, it's half of them. And of course, these are already households and persons that are higher risk of energy poverty. And they often have limited possibilities to implement energy renovations on their own, like legal, financial, and so on. And many programs, they target owners only, who maybe don't have enough incentive to actually invest in improvements on the rental housing because it's the tenant that pays the bills, right? So then they are left behind from this support or outside of this support. But on the other hand, when the renovations are implemented in rental housing, sometimes it leads also to disproportionate rent increases that may drive these tenants outside because they cannot afford any longer to live in that household if the landlord shifts the cost on the rent. So there are these two risks coming in, and we really do not see much safeguards against them or incentives to renovate. So I think this is also important to keep in mind. And third point here, maybe that it's when we are talking about renovation programs and climate and energy transition policies in general, sometimes they really don't address the situation of extreme vulnerability and poverty. And we see it, for example, with extreme energy poverty. So the situation when there is when people really do not have access or stable access to electricity or basic energy services. These are often people who live in precarious or informal housing. So they are a little bit outside of this legal framework and criteria. And we see these situations. The pictures that I have here concern the Cañada Real Galiana, which is a shanty town near Madrid, which was disconnected by energy company from electricity, and people there couldn't get this basic service for years already. And there was a complaint brought by a coalition of NGOs before the European Committee of Social Rights, and the committee in its decision highlighted that access to energy is indispensable for realization of a number of rights. But of course, we see this situation also in other countries. So our point here is also to address these extreme situations of vulnerability also in the context of energy and climate transition, because these risks, they often intersect with also increased climate risks. For finding here is participation and information are often not inclusive. So maybe that speaks also a little bit to your experiences from the project. Of course, they are required by law, including by specific pieces of energy related legislation. In practice, what we see that consultations are often one-off exercise. They are usually in preparatory phase only, and not, for example, in the implementation or monitoring. And it's often not clear how these contributions from consultations have been taken into account in the design. But also in terms of programs, the information outreach leaves some space for improvement, let's say. So it's often online only. Sometimes it's complex and technical. So it's difficult for this information to reach those who might actually most need this kind of support. But again, to highlight a few positive examples. So for example, in Czechia, we saw that there was a wide campaign, including a TV series that explained in an accessible way different aspects of energy renovations to try to reach the broader population. In Spain, and I think that was in Barcelona specifically, there were points of advice, and they were also called energy advice points. So to avoid stigmatization and talking, for example, about energy poverty, which might drive some of the people in vulnerable situations away. So let's say that this communication aspects are also important to avoid stigmatization and to support inclusion. And 5, and that's my last one for today, is accountability. So we see gaps in programs in terms of monitoring, in terms of data. So there is no comprehensive framework to monitor rights impacts of climate and energy measures, and this is actually true also at the EU level. We see limited disaggregation. In the programs, complaint mechanism, they exist, but they're often very complex. They are difficult to access, and sometimes it's not clear what happens with a complaint when it is submitted. And we also see the limited role of human rights institutions and equality bodies, and this is often because of limited mandates and resources. And again, just to highlight a few promising examples that we identified. One is from France, which collects regularly data on energy renovations, also surveying households that underwent renovations, asking about their quality of life and other aspects as well. In Catalonia, the regional ombudsperson has pretty strong mandate to intervene in energy poverty and energy access context, including they can intervene directly with energy providers. And in Estonia, in the project in Estonia, we've seen that accessibility objectives were embedded in the renovation programs, which also means that then they are monitored and reported on. So with these findings, I just want to highlight, or I think what they highlight is that this human rights-based approach is really needed to ensure that these programs design and policies design, they include safeguards, and they really are designed in a way that leave no one behind in practice, not only in a declaratory way. And we have some suggestions in the report. So we have for our opinions. I'm sorry, that's a lot of text, but it's already condensed. So we suggest to integrate fundamental rights into the climate and energy transition policies, to strengthen safeguards in energy renovation policies and programs. We suggest member states to define and operationalize vulnerability in the context of energy transition, and really ensure that these programs on energy renovation are designed in a way that enable access in practice and protect the rights of tenants. We also highlight the need to address housing deprivation and extreme energy poverty, and this is where also climate and social policy could be better aligned. And we highlight the need to ensure meaningful public participation, transparent, accessible, independent complaints mechanisms, and also monitoring and data collection. So I will stop here. I would just like to invite you all to read our report. I hope you will find it useful also in your work. Maybe just a notice that we will also publish country reports from the field work from the 10 countries where we conducted it in the coming days, I think next week. So please also watch out for that. And with that, I would like to thank you very much again, and I'm happy to take questions if there are any.